So, friends, how do you decide which way to go on our journey when the old way of doing things no longer works? When we don't have a roadmap and we can't even see the road ahead of us? Our next presenter, the Reverend Susan Beaumont, will guide us. She will show us how to turn on our own GPS, our God positioning systems, and use the light that Bishop Tracy reminded us about that exists in each of us. Reverend Beaumont serves on faculty at Wesley Theological School and teaches leadership and organizational strategies across multiple denominations as she leads Susan Beaumont and Associates. Her teaching session will begin with a recorded instructional video, followed by a live question and answer session. As the training session is playing, please feel free to go ahead and enter any questions that you have using the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen. We will be gathering those questions and seek to provide answers to as many as possible after the recording presentations. Friends, Reverend Beaumont.
Good morning. My name is Susan Beaumont, and I'm delighted to be with you here at the I Am Her Leadership Summit. Today, we're going to be talking about being inspired, being empowered, and being equipped in a season that does not seem ripe for doing any of those kinds of things. The topic of our conversation today is how to lead when you don't know where you're going. The content that we're going to be talking about today comes from a book that I published just about a year ago now called How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, Leading in a Liminal Season. I have been working with congregations for about 25 years now, doing consulting in the areas of leadership development and organizational development. 9 of those years were with the Alban Institute, where I was a senior consultant on staff. My areas of specialty historically have been staff team dynamics, board development, strategic planning, and pastoral transition. But about 5 years ago, I began to notice a really disturbing trend in my work with congregations. It seemed as if, as the church was declining, we were increasingly turning to the organizational side of church life to try to redeem things. And that there was this growing deep divide between the spiritual leadership life of our leaders and the organizational health and life of the congregation. And as the church was facing decline, we were leaning into the organizational side rather than the spiritual side. This was really troubling me. So I began a program to become a spiritual director with the Shalem Institute, thinking that perhaps I was being called to become a spiritual director to pastors. But about halfway through that program, the clarity began emerging for me that I was being called to something different, but it was a shift in the focus of how I was doing my consulting work. And the thing that took hold of me in that season was the notion that my work was about tending the soul of the institution. And although I didn't at first really know what that meant to me, I stuck with that for a period of years and began trying to research and speak out of that space of working with the soulfulness of the institution. And the content of what we're going to talk about today is me bringing you into where I am on that journey. So I hope you'll enjoy the conversation along with me. I'd like to begin our time by talking about or just sharing with you this brief jewel of a poem by Christine McDougall called Liminal. The space between, neither this nor that, ripe, potent, uncertain, shaky, a dawning, a dusking, the imminent threshold emerging, crossing to what? Slow down. The moment is calling you to pay exquisite attention. Paying exquisite attention is really what we're going to be talking about today. What does that mean in a chaotic season like this one? Liminality is a word that many of us have not encountered with regularity in our everyday lexicon, so let's begin with the definition. It's a quality of ambiguity or disorientation that we all feel that happens when we're in transitory kinds of situations and spaces. It's when a person or a group of people are stuck betwixt and between something that has already ended and something new that is not yet ready to begin. And so the space in between, where things are not defined, where there is no normal footing, and that produces high levels of anxiety, disruption, and disturbance. What Richard Rohr has to say about liminality is that it's the space that human beings hate to occupy, where the biblical God is always taking us. Rohr points out that every single one of our great biblical stories is a story of liminality, beginning with Adam and Eve being driven from the Garden of Eden, out of that place of perfection into a liminal experience, a space in between. And the story sets us up really for a journey that's entirely liminal as people of faith, between that place of perfection in the Garden of Eden and the day sometime in our future when we return to that garden with God. But everything in between is this liminality, and every single one of our biblical heroes goes through multiple liminal experiences. Abraham and Sarah leave the comfort of their home to journey out into a new land and claim a new place as matriarchs and patriarchs of our entire tradition. Noah spends a liminal season within the confines of an ark. Jonah has a liminal experience in the belly of a whale. Every great biblical story is a story about being stuck in the in-between and the transformative work that God does there. Even up through Jesus coming up out of the baptismal waters and going out into the wilderness to be tested. And Paul on the road from Damascus, who is struck by lightning and blinded. So if we know that God works with liminality, the question is, why is it that we're so uncomfortable here, and why do we want to get out of it? Well, all liminal experiences are really about a three-part transition structure. And this work comes to us from the sociologist Victor Turner, and previously from the cultural anthropologist Arnold van Geppen. And both of these researchers have shown us or illustrated how a liminal experience is always about a letting go, kind of akin to letting go of the trapeze we see here in this picture. An in-between time of great uncertainty, that's called the liminal period, where you are suspended in between two known certainties, and then a reassimilation period where we attach onto a new normal and start to feel again stable, but reorienting into something that is new but different than the place that we left behind. When we think about liminality, we can find it in all kinds of ways around us. On a daily basis, we experience the liminal dawning and dusking of the sun. All around us, there are liminal contexts, places that have that experience of being in the in-between. One place that I commonly encounter as a liminal space is the airport. When we're in a non-pandemic season, I do a lot of travel and weekly find myself walking in and out of airports, climbing on and off of airplanes. One of the things I have noticed when I enter the airport, which is not a destination for anyone other than perhaps the people who work there, is that once I've moved through the TSA checkpoint, I begin to experience an unsettlingness in my own spirit, and I move rapidly just to move through that space. Even when I have hours before a flight that I need to catch, I'll move rapidly to just move through and get to a place that feels more settled. Similarly, when I climb on the airplane, I behave in a way that I wouldn't behave in any other kind of context. I sit down in a seat and I'm sharing body space with a person next to me, an armrest or perhaps some leg space. And what I've noticed is I don't even talk to the person usually sitting next to me other than a polite hello or a nod at the beginning of the journey. That behavior of being disengaged from other people I would not find that acceptable in any other setting, but because I'm in liminal space, there are different norms that preside. There's a different way of being when I'm there in that liminal context. We are also all accustomed to having liminal seasons that begin and end in some kinds of predictable ways. For example, like the transition of pastors in a congregation. In the time that we let go of one pastor, the congregation enters this special kind of space where they have to kind of rediscover who they are without the leadership of that one pastor before they're ready to accept the leadership of another. Even if that new pastor shows up the very next day, there is this liminal season of transition where everything is unsettled and no one quite knows how to attach and how to behave around one another in this period of transition. There are also liminal eras and epochs. Phyllis Tickle talked about this in her book, The Great Emergence, when she talked about the church's giant rummage sale that tends to happen every 500 years or so when we go through the Reformation, each of the great awakenings. And many authors have argued that we find ourselves in one of these liminal epochs right now, that the church has fundamentally stopped working the way that it did, the way that it thrived for so many years, and that we're not yet ready to name what a new normal is. What is a new model or way of thriving in the next era? And so we find ourselves in the in-between place in this era, even before we were hit with pandemic. But the experience of pandemic has drawn into high relief for everyone just what this liminality feels like. We've been thrown out of our buildings, and we find ourselves in this new virtual space that feels strange and awkward to many of us. And we're beginning to acknowledge that regardless of when we re-enter our buildings, this period of disorientation and rediscovery of a new way of being is going to be with us for some time. We're not going back to an old normal, even as we re-enter those buildings. Liminality is going to be with us for a period of time. And then the racial justice reckoning that is blossoming all around us, I think is no mistake that that's occurring at the same time as the pandemic. It's not a coincidence. The pandemic began to break us down in ways that we have been able to pay more exquisite attention to things that have been happening for decades, for the longest period of time to which we were not attending. And suddenly we find ourselves here in this liminal space, able to attend to the unfreezing of structures that for so long have been racist and oppressive for so many. The thesis of my work here on this topic is that we are living in a liminal era, which is not likely to end anytime soon. And that because we are in this era, it's calling forth from us a different kind of leadership stance than what we traditionally use, and a different body of leadership work. Many of the leadership practices that we have called upon for so long really don't serve us well in a season like this one. So some might ask, isn't this just change management that you're talking about? And haven't we been talking forever about how to help people adapt through change management? Well, yes and no. You see, the thing about change management is that most of that literature comes out of a place of saying, we're here at point A, and we can see that we want to get to point B. And change management is trying to help people adapt to what has to happen in between here, the obstacles that need to be overcome, the barriers we need to override. The difference about what we're talking about here in a liminal season is that we often don't know where we are, and we don't know how to talk about where we're going. We don't know how to define point A. This was illustrated for me just last week. I was listening to or watching a video of a pastor I admire, and he was talking about coming into the church building and with all kinds of certainty was explaining what the protocol was going to be and saying, this is our target date and we're targeting to come back into the building on this date. And then he ended the video by saying, or we won't, right? So we're planning, we're trying to define where it is that we are, what is this place we find ourselves in, and yet the ground shifts daily beneath our feet. So we don't know with any certainty really where we stand. And we don't know how to describe with clear language where we want to take our people. And yet we have to lead. We can't sit in a season like this and just say to people, let's wait it out, because there's too much important work that has to be done. There's too much learning that has to take place and experimentation. So the question then is, how do you lead people when you don't know where you are and where you're going? And that's the essence and the challenge of liminality. A new piece of scripture well, it's an ancient piece of scripture, but it's new to me, that I have discovered of late that I just love, is in the 3rd chapter of the book of Ezra. Now, this is not a piece of scripture that we run across often because it's not in our lectionary experience. And so just to frame it for you, this piece of scripture takes place when the foundation of the second temple has been laid. So the first temple has been destroyed, is long gone, and the people are gathering for a ritual as the foundation of that second temple is taking shape. And so this is meant to be a moment that both reflects on and acknowledges what has been lost, but also anticipates with joy what is about to happen, the construction of a new temple. And this is what scripture says for us. And all the people gave a great shout of praise to the Lord, because the foundation of the house of the Lord was laid. And many of the older priests and the Levites and the family heads who had seen the former temple, they wept aloud when they saw the foundation of this temple being laid, while others shouted for joy. And no one could distinguish the sound of the shouts of joy from the sound of weeping, because the people made so much noise, and the sound was heard far away. This is the experience we're having right now as leaders. So much noise that we have to filter our way through. The noise of those people who are feeling so disoriented and in grief over what has been lost. The noise of those who are so excited about what this new season might mean in terms of creativity and new opportunities. The noise of denominational systems telling us what it is that we're supposed to be doing, and big decisions being made within the larger United Methodist Church about a future together. Racial reckoning conversations, some of which we need to pay attention to and some of which are just noisy distractions. A political environment that is generating noise continuously. What is a leader supposed to pay attention to? Ed Catmull is the CEO of Pixar, and he wrote this beautiful book called Creativity, Inc. Now, the book is a secular book, but Ed Catmull is a deeply contemplative person who writes about creativity and innovation, and he says this: there's a sweet spot between the known and the unknown where originality happens. And the key is to be able to linger there without panicking. What Catmull refers to here is the deep, deep impulse that we all have when we're standing in a place of danger like this one, to escape from it, to move away from it and out of it as quickly as we can. It's almost like we're standing in front of this black hole that threatens to just draw us in to oblivion with its gravity. And so the typical response for most of us in a leadership position is to strive hard to get out of that place. It's to get out of the liminality, to not be in a place that feels so uncertain and so shaky. And yet what Catmull reminds us is that this is the very place we need to be. This is the place that God works with us, that has limitless opportunities for creativity and innovation, if only we can learn how to stand here in a non-anxious kind of way and take advantage of some of those opportunities that a season like this one offers us. Because a season of liminality offers a variety of opportunities, but it also offers a number of threats that need to be attended to. And keeping this in balance so that we can take advantage of the opportunity while minimizing the threats is part of the challenge of leading well in a season like this one. So I want to talk about these opportunities and the threats in turn. One of the first major opportunities for us is something that's called Communitas. Again, this term was coined by Arnold van Gennep back when he was studying how liminality works within tribal cultures. And he was intentional about coming up with this word and saying it's not community, it's not the gathered body of people, it's a way of being as the gathered body of people, Communitas. It's what happens in a liminal experience when the hierarchies and the structures begin to fail and the institution no longer holds. When that happens, when the liminality gets so straight that so strained, so many levels of liminality piling on top of one another, much like the United Methodist Church is experiencing right now, we see parts of the institutional infrastructure beginning to crumble and new things will emerge. But in this state of crumbling is where the opportunity is for a great leveling to happen, for the elimination of hierarchies and power divides, for all voices to find kind of a unitive consciousness together and to discover this intense creativity that's available to us only in a season like this one. Another tremendous opportunity in a liminal season is the rediscovery of our core identity and purpose. This is a great season for talking about things like, well, who are we now? The answer to that question is changing daily for us as we find that we're no longer limited by geography, right? We've been attracting people from all kinds of different places because we're now meeting virtually. It's changing the very way we talk, or it should be changing the very way we talk about ourselves. Who are we? It's also changing our understanding of who we serve. We're no longer bound by the geography of 3 miles right around our church building. Certainly, that's always going to be important to us, that we have a presence within our local community. But that's not the only way we should be answering the question, who do we serve? And what is God calling us to do or become now? My former colleague, Gil Rendell, likes to talk about this as discovering our proximate purpose right now, not talking about the big, bold mission that we're trying to accomplish long term that's way out there for us, but almost like a leader standing in place in the dark, holding a flashlight and shining that flashlight just 2 feet in front and saying, where's the next right place for me to put my feet? What's the next right step of something that we can do that creates the sense that we're moving forward together in something? And then when we get there, we will shine that flashlight out 2 more feet. And 2 feet at a time will make our forward progress in a liminal season. So this is an opportunity as a season to begin shedding what no longer fits us. I've heard from so many pastors in recent weeks sharing stories of programs and ministries and maybe even worship services that they felt had been dragging the church down for a while, taking too many resources to maintain, but they were beloved by some. And so it was too hard to cut the cords and eliminate some of those things. And then through pandemic, they're just gone. They're just disappearing. And the question becomes, what do we do as we begin re-entering our buildings? We need to be careful not to blindly reinstitute some things that we actually should be shedding along the way. It's a rare opportunity and season for doing that kind of work. Liminal season is also a great time to be deepening or strengthening our discernment muscles. For so long as the church, we have thrown around the term discernment. We need to discern that. Usually, when we talk that way, we've been using the secularized version of discernment. We're going to use good, rational discourse and throw in a prayer on the side. A season like this one is a season to reclaim some of the ancient practices in our tradition for deeply listening to the leading of God's Spirit in our midst, of figuring out how to take next steps, not based on our own good logic, but on our own sense, our own shared sense of what God is doing in our midst and how we can come alongside and join that. Of course, liminal seasons aren't all just about that creative opportunity. There's a lot of threats going along with it that many of us have been living palpably in recent weeks. The first is that in liminality, anxiety for people rises. And you may have noticed this, I certainly have. When people are anxious, they don't behave well. There's a lot of dysfunctional behavior emerging within our communities. And the challenge for a leader is to figure out how much to pay attention to the dysfunction, how much of your effort and energy to put into reducing that anxiety, because every amount of effort we put into that is less energy and resource that we have to put into an exciting new thing. So the challenge of leadership is trying to figure out how to not let the anxiety get so high that people are incapacitated and can't do any adaptive work, and how to not let that anxiety derail us at the same time by taking too much of our effort and energy. Another threat in a liminal season is the whole challenge of denial. And denial in a season like this one tends to look like one of two things. One is the whole group of people that simply wants to power through as if nothing has really changed here. There isn't really a pandemic happening, or minimizing it by saying, as soon as we get back in our buildings, we'll be fine. We just have to wait it out. That's one form of denial that locks us in a place of not adapting. The other form of denial is to say, nothing remains, is to get hysterical and say, the church is dead, the church is gone, we're not going to come back from this. That's also not true. There's a great deal that has always been a part of who we are, that will always be with us, regardless of where we're worshiping, regardless of what the next chapter looks like. Some things will remain. One of the big threats in a liminal season is the change in power dynamics that happens. Many of you have probably already noticed within your congregations that some of your tried and true leaders have kind of stepped to the sidelines in this period. For some, it might be because they don't really feel comfortable in a virtual environment, or they just feel like, I'm overwhelmed, I just need to take a break. And for some, that stepping back might become kind of a permanent thing. You've probably also noticed that there have been others around the edges of the organization who have stepped into the center, and they're bringing new ideas and new energy, and they're really excited about the prospect of what could be happening in this changing season. So there's a certain amount of excitement in that, a fresh leadership blood, a kind of a fresh energy, but there's also a danger in it as we're going through this shift in the power dynamics of who's in charge and whose voice will hold sway. We're also noticing that we're a little bit at risk. What if it's too much transition all at once and we don't retain any of our institutional memory about how things work best in a season like this one? And a very real threat as these power dynamics change is the character of the trickster. And Victor Turner, again, identified the trickster as a common character that appears in liminal seasons. Tricksters are dangerous characters because they initially present themselves to us as highly charismatic, competent individuals. They typically are people who have not been at the center of organizational dynamics. They've been hanging around the edges or just slightly outside of the organization until the liminal season began. And then they assert themselves and step into the center. And the way that they do that is by convincing people that they know what they're talking about, because they can talk enough like a solid managerial kind of leadership presence that people listen to them and say, they're making some sense. This is some fresh blood. Maybe we ought to listen to that. And the trickster takes advantage of that and places themselves front and center and grabs a lot of the power at the center. The problem is that the trickster is not a healthy player. The trickster is actually incapable of living well in community and feeds on chaos and discontent. So the trickster's not at all interested in resolving liminality or taking the organization anywhere. They're only interested in hanging on to power, being at the center, and sowing discord and creating more chaos, because that's what they thrive on. So one of the challenges that happens in many transitional seasons is that organizations find themselves with these kinds of characters at the center of things, which begins to take a huge amount of leadership energy to try to figure out, what do we do about this character? How do we minimize the damage they're doing, and how do we actually move them out of the center and back over to the sides of the organization where they can't do quite as much damage? So I want you to take a moment right here for reflection. We'll take a moment to help you, just give you a break from listening to my voice continuously. But I want you to be thinking about a couple of questions here. Pandemic and racial justice reckoning have moved all of us into liminal space. I'd like you to take a moment to think about what other factors specific to your local context are adding to your experience of liminality now. what's happening in your context. I also like you to think about what's possible before that's no longer possible now or must be pursued in a different way now. Let's just take a moment of quiet to think about those questions. I hope that these are questions that you will continue to grapple with in the weeks ahead as you begin to notice in a new way how your environment is being impacted by this liminal experience that we're all having. What new opportunities are emerging for you to pay attention to. Now, we've been talking about the notion of liminality, which I have defined for you as that ambiguous, disoriented state. I want to introduce two other terms that I use to talk about a season like this one. The first term is leading with presence. And when I use that phrase, what I'm talking about is the fundamental leadership stance that works better in a season like this than the traditional kind of leadership stance that we may have learned in the past. This kind of leadership is grounded in a sense of wonder and a sense of contemplative opening to the leading of the divine. The other phrase that I want to introduce to you is the idea of tending to the soul of the institution, which I'm using to refer to a body of leadership work that invites us to access the true self of the institution, the part of the institution that knows what needs to happen next. My premise being that when the soul of the leader connects with the soul of the institution, that's when we experience congregational vitality. That's when we experience what it means to be inspired and empowered and equipped, when we connect our soul with the soul of the institution. And that's what we're going to use the remainder of our time to talk about these two concepts. Heifetz, in his work on adaptive leadership, gave us this chart that I have put up on the screen. And what Heifetz says is that traditionally, leadership has been defined, effective leadership has been defined as the one who provides direction to the organization, who protects the organization from outside threats, and who provides order by orienting people to their roles, by defining problems and providing solutions, by minimizing conflicts and restoring order, and to maintaining institutional norms. That the people inside of organizations who demonstrate their ability to do that are the individuals who are rewarded with positions of authority. And so we've created this kind of heroic perspective of what it means to be that kind of leader. I want to go on to say that that traditional leadership stance of providing direction and control and order is grounded in a spiritual stance that I would describe as a sense of knowing, which is having clear expertise about lots of things that the institution values, about being able to advocate for what is right in a moment, to pick a course of action and pursue it with dogged persistence until a problem is solved, and by striving to achieve. If you just think about how your colleagues oftentimes talk about leadership life, we're often comparing ourselves according to our level of exhaustion. Oh, I worked so hard. I'm working too hard. I'm not getting enough sleep. I'm not taking care of myself. Ritualistically, we like to complain about our striving stance because we secretly admire it in ourselves and in one another. What I want to point out here is that a season like this one requires a shift from us. We need to shift out of the false self that's an ego construct, The false self is the caricature I've created that I want the world to see about my leadership. And that false self is rooted in that sense of knowing and advocating and striving. That my true self, the self that is known by God, the individual I was created to be in God, is rooted in a different set of things. That self is rooted in a place of unknowing and attending and surrender. So let's talk about these 3 shifts and how you might invite that into your lives. The first shift, moving from a place of knowing to a place of unknowing, is not about getting stupid. It's not about giving up on learning new things. An unknowing place is a place where I still have a lot of expertise that I hold, but I hold it loosely. An unknowing stance is one in which I remain suspicious about my own knowing because I recognize the limitations that it has for me in a season like this one. I'd like to share a story with you of how I was kind of grabbed up short and forced to move from my knowing to an unknowing stance. It's a story from a few years back when I was working with a congregation that was doing some strategic planning work. The leaders in this organization had just spent 3 months gathering all kinds of data, internally and externally, to help them in their planning task. And we were coming together for a weekend retreat, a Friday night, and an all-day Saturday event to process that learning together and also to claim the future direction of the congregation. Now, I have facilitated this kind of a retreat event more times than I can count. I know I'm pretty good at that kind of group facilitation. I also know that if you don't facilitate that event extraordinarily carefully, what ends up happening is you hit the end of the weekend without resolution or without a future direction, and people are very frustrated and feel like they have totally wasted their time. So facilitating that event hard and sharp so that everybody stays on task and does the work that they need to do is critically important. And I know I'm pretty good at that kind of work. Well, on this particular weekend, a character showed up that I'm going to name Joel, who arrived about a half an hour before we began. And immediately my facilitator antenna went up because I was able to see that Joel, while he appeared to be a very bright individual, seemed totally incapable of functioning within the group. He wanted to undo everything that had already been done. He was very discordant about everything. He just couldn't quite fit in and go with the flow. And immediately I realized that if this retreat was going to stay on track, I was going to have to control Joel and his disruptive energy. So I got busy keeping Joel busy and moving him around from one table to the next and giving him chores to do on the side so that he couldn't be too disruptive in any one context. And I was feeling pretty good about the retreat and my own leadership well into the second day of the event. We were gathered together on late Saturday morning in small groups, and the small groups were doing good work. There was a good energy in the room, I thought, when I saw Joel out of the corner of my eye get up from his table and come over to talk to me. And Joel got in my face and he said, "We need to stop now and pray." And I immediately chastised Joe and said, "You need to go back and sit down, because right now the small groups are working and they're doing their work well. And when this small group dialogue is over, then we're going to have a group prayer time at that time. So you need to go sit down." Joel said no, and he got in my face again and he said, "We need to pray." And this exchange between Joel and I went back and forth 3 or 4 times, each time him raising his voice further, until people started noticing that Joel and I were having an altercation at the front of the room. And I finally thought, well, I need to yield to this, and I'm just going to have to figure out how to capture this time back later. Okay, we'll stop and we'll pray. So I brought the pastor up. We took some time in small groups. Everyone seemed kind of disoriented when I pulled them out of their work. The pastor said, "We're going to do this now?" Yep, Joel thinks we need to pray right now. And so to this day, I cannot fully explain what happened in that room at that point in time. But everyone in the days and weeks after the event talked about the energy in the room and how it shifted palpably in that moment following the prayer, how the best ideas about the future of the congregation bubbled up there in that moment. You see, Joel sensed that I needed to unknow all of the certainty I had about how that event needed to unfold. I needed to move into a place of unknowing to let something more organic happen there in that moment. And to this day, I thank him for his careful leadership in that moment. Many people asked later, how did you know to do that? I didn't. I fought that letting go of my own sense of knowing. But Joel pulled us there out of that stance of knowing into unknowing. And in that unknowing place is where the freshness and the creativity could emerge. And the second spiritual shift we need to make in a season like this one as leaders is out of that place of advocacy into a place of attending, a place of paying exquisite attention, of stopping our action simply to notice deeply what's happening around us and what's wanting to emerge if it can only find some fresh air in it to fan it into flame. So another personal story I'll share about a time when I was pulled out of advocacy and drawn into attending. This time actually out of a vacation that my husband and I had, a bicycling vacation to Acadia National Forest in Maine. We had signed up for this trip. My husband's a pretty solid biker. I'm not. I go along to do what I can. And the brochure said, lightly rolling hills. Any of you who've been to Acadia know that that's hyperbole. There's some monster hills inside that park. And I realized by the end of day one, I was in some pretty serious trouble because I was having a hard time making it up the hills, oftentimes climbing off my bike and walking to the top of the hill, grumbling a lot, not enjoying my vacation, not having the experience in nature I thought I had signed on for. And in this space, I discovered this approach that really started working for me. And so I glommed onto it and became a staunch advocate of this approach. And here was the approach. When I got to a hill, instead of looking up at the hill and becoming overwhelmed, what I did instead was I stared down at my feet and I counted the revolution of the pedals. I would count to 10 and then begin again. And the dialogue I would have in my mind is, I can do 10 more. And I'd count those 10 off. I can do 10 more. And I could get myself up to the top of these hills by not getting overwhelmed, by taking in too much, by staying in this narrow stance of just advocating this small little approach that helped me to feel like I was in control. And I went through 2 days of doing that, frankly being kind of miserable most of the time I was doing it, but feeling like, all right, I'm not embarrassing myself, at least I'm getting through this. And all the while, people would come up alongside of me and try to teach me things about how to shift my gears differently, or how to position myself better on the bike, or how to stand as I was pedaling up the hills. And I would have none of it because I had discovered my technique and it was getting me through, and I stuck with it. Until day 3, when I was exhausted, it began to rain. My foot slipped off the pedals and I actually fell off the bike. It was a moment of abject failure. I was pretty discouraged when a still small voice in the back of my head said, look up, look up. And when I looked up, at the top of this hill that I was battling against was a beautiful white lighthouse with a bright, crisp red tile roof, set against the backdrop of a crystal blue ocean and a double-arched rainbow going clear across the top of that lighthouse. It was such a beautiful sight that it immediately took me into a place of what I would call unitive awareness, where I was awake and alive, where I noticed things deeply that I hadn't been paying attention to, the chirping of the crickets, the smell of the pine, what it felt like to have the raindrops on my skin. And I was just overwhelmed by the beauty of it all. Well, that moment of failure was a moment for me of being broken open and drawn out of my stance of advocating for an approach and grappling my way through it into stopping to pay exquisite attention. And had I done that more naturally on my own a little earlier, it's quite possible I could have learned some new skills. I could have enjoyed more of the experience I was trying to have out in nature, and that the awe in the horizons could have pulled me right up those hills by deeply attending to what I was noticing around me. Now, the third shift that I want to talk about is the shift away from striving, that working harder and exhausting myself, trying to prove that I'm better than this thing, into a surrendering stance. By surrender here, I do not mean giving up. I do not mean sitting back in my chair sighing and say, oh, well, I just have to wait this out. I mean a deep spiritual yielding to what is. Surrender is about saying, I'm in this circumstance. If I fight it, I'm going to exhaust myself and not get anywhere. If I yield to what's happening to me right now, it will allow me to look around and adapt to my environment and take some steps that are more positive. But all the time that I spend in striving mode is going to keep me locked in my old status quo. Now, the story I'd like to share here is actually not my story personally, but the story of my brother and sister-in-law, and they have given me permission to share their story when I teach about this concept. About 10 years ago, my sister-in-law, Julie, was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease at the age of 56, and it was devastating for all of us. It was very interesting, though, to watch the varied reactions of family members. There were those in the family who adopted a striving stance. They were battling, they wanted to battle against this disease. Let's not accept this diagnosis. There are other doctors we can see. There are other protocols to follow. There are new drugs being discovered. We need to not just yield into this. We need to stand against it. And yet Tom and Julie chose a different route. They chose to surrender. They didn't give up. They did experience grief and they owned their grief, but they immediately moved into a stance of saying, this is where we are. This is the disease that we will be living with. And their yielding, their surrender to the diagnosis allowed them to very creatively engage and plan for their next years. My brother was able to quit his job and begin traveling with Julie, who was a gifted public speaker who began speaking nationally on behalf of the Alzheimer's Association while she still could. They were able to make plans for where Julie would live when she could no longer be at home, and she could participate in those decisions. And they made many plans and found many new programs about the enrichment of their life that they couldn't have found and invested in if they were spending all their time striving against that diagnosis. Recently, when I heard my brother talking about their journey through Alzheimer's, he said this: we didn't choose Alzheimer's, it chose us. But eventually we learned to choose it back. We learned to choose it back for all that it could teach us about our circumstance and our growth as human beings through that illness and through that diagnosis. That's an illustration of making the move out of the striving stance into that place of surrender. And when we get there, to that place of unknowing and attending and surrender, what happens for us is that we wake up in all kinds of new ways that are highly generative and produce lots of energy. We step into leading from a place of awe and wonder by standing in the knowing, by surrendering to new questions, by standing in awe of what wants to emerge instead of investing all of our energies trying to cling to a thing that is gone. Now, inevitably, when I talk about this form of leadership, somebody will ask the question, doesn't this just make me look weak? Particularly for us as women who so often feel like we have to fight for what little authority we have. Won't moving into a place of unknowing and attending and surrender just make it look to outsiders like we're not really leading? Now, sadly, the answer to that question is, on some level, yes. People don't like it when their leaders quit fixing problems and quit restoring order and quit orienting them to their roles and their situation. They want their leaders to fix their problems. When we stand firmly with people in this place of unknowing, we have to discover some new techniques for how to communicate that we're still in charge, even though we're not rushing around and fixing their problems. Part of how we do that is by occasionally stepping in to restore order, to calm people down, by helping to frame why we're standing where we are, by naming what we see, helping people to realize it's not that I'm ignoring things, I'm seeing what the issue is, but I cannot fix this problem for you. We have to learn some new things together. And this is a whole different way of being inside of the organization. Now, once you have developed a different kind of stance, once you are leading with presence, you actually have to do something with that presence. No organization is going to let you lead if you don't take action with them and engage them in doing some work. People have to feel like there is a productive body of something that they're doing together in the liminal season. And many of the things that we traditionally try to do to recreate order when things feel chaotic, like planning, like visioning, they just don't serve us well in a season like this one. But there are several bodies of work that I think come together under this banner that I call tending the soul of the institution that are appropriate for a season like this one. As we begin this part of the conversation, our last part of our conversation together really, I want to pose the question to you, what is it you believe about whether or not an institution has a soul? I've struggled with this language for a long time. I'm trying to name the essence of the something more that expresses itself in institutional life that wants to be heard. It is not the Holy Spirit movement through the organization. I've been in rooms when that happens and it's like a breath of fresh air coming through the organization, but it's from outside. It comes through and it changes us and it leaves again. I'm talking about something that is rooted deep within the organization itself, that goes beyond organizational culture, that goes beyond the spirituality of the place, that goes beyond the collective voice of the present leadership body, but something that is grounded and rooted in the history and the story of the place that has a life of its own. And if there was ever any doubt in my mind as to whether that thing existed, some time ago when Notre Dame burned, there was this global outpouring of grief around the loss of that institutional place that for me gave voice to that notion of soul. It wasn't just a piece of architecture that people felt like they were losing. It was a place that institutionally captured a lore and a story of a people and a history that had character and soul in and of itself. So how do we talk about what that thing is? I imagine that many of you will have different ways of talking about the soulfulness of your institution. Some people might want to use the language of, say, it's the DNA of who we are, that extends beyond the current leadership body, but that's rooted in this time and this place. I want to just introduce this as a possible definition. The soul is the authentic and the truest self of the institution. It's the source of the organization's divine calling and character. It's the protector of institutional integrity, that somewhere within the organization, there is a voice that may have been muffled over time that knows who this institution is and who it needs to be. I would argue that as the United Methodist Church is grappling with its identity about who it needs to be long-term and what form that institution will take moving forward, that there is this divine spark within that knows. And if we as leaders can sometimes get ourselves out of the way to listen for that sense of divine calling within the institution itself, that we can find our way back to it. And I'd like to suggest that there are 4 bodies of work that help us in connecting with the soul of the institution, and it's worthy work to be doing in a season like this one. The first body of work is deepening our discernment muscles and practices, is getting ourselves away from the practice of using Robert's rule of order and linear, rational, logical decision making, and moving into a place where we use some ancient prayer practices, quite frankly, to help our leaders attend to what God is doing in our midst and how to align ourselves with that energy. That's an important body of work to be doing right now. A second important body of work is the shaping of institutional memory, because the stories we tell about our organizations and our institutions hold the key to recognizing over time what has been core to us and our values and our principles that can inform us now. And many of us are leading organizations that have damaged institutional memory, memory that has to be reclaimed and reframed and restored in some important ways so that people can be freed from some of the shame of the institution and empowered to discover a new bright chapter. This is a season to be doing clarifying work around purpose, as I was talking about earlier, answering the questions, who are we now? How is that changing? Who do we serve now? How is that changing? What are the values that our next steps need to embody? And what do we feel that God is calling us to do in this next immediate part of our future? Not an articulation of what we've historically been good at, but who are we now? What's God calling forth from us next and now? And then the fourth body of work that's important for a season like this one is engaging people in emergence. Emergence theory teaches us that no liminality, no season of chaos will continue indefinitely, that the chaos will eventually resolve itself. It will eventually we will be freed up from the disorientation and the disintegration of the past, that we'll have a period of experimentation and creativity and the discovery of new things, and that we will live our way into a new normal that will cohere around some important principles and values moving forward. The challenge about engaging emergence is that it's not activity that you as a leader can manufacture or manage. Emergence happens organically and naturally. But there are things that we can do as leaders to nurture it on its journey and to stay out of the way of it and to help the organization claim when we're ready to move into a new stage of emergence. There's so much more to talk about related to these four bodies of work, and we don't have time in the context of today's brief session to do that. But again, I want to direct you back to the book, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going, Leading in a Liminal Season, where you can read a lot more rich examples and some guiding principles for engaging in those four kinds of work. So I'm going to wrap up our conversation here and open our space for some question and answer time and give you the opportunity to be in dialogue with me about some of the concepts that we've talked about today. Thank you for joining me on this journey.
And hello, Susan. Welcome.
Thank you, Dawn. It's great to be here live and in person. Thank you.
And I just wanted to point out to our attendees also that all of our speakers have books that are referenced. You can go to those on your website if you'd like to purchase those. There is a link so you can learn more about Susan's wonderful work by going there. But let's start off with some questions. We've had some great questions coming
Good.
during the presentation. This one I love. How do we discern the difference between a trickster, a disruptor, and a person who's inspired and just interrupting?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think it's the quintessential question that we all face is the issue of, it would be great if there were 4 warning signs too. This person is a trickster, don't let them in. Unfortunately, for most of us, we don't recognize signs until after they are well in. For me, the distinguishing feature between someone who might just be an innovator or a disruptor with great new ideas and the individual who's truly a trickster is their spiritual health and well-being. To the extent that you can evaluate an individual and say, how much emotional stability and well-being does this individual have? And what kind of spiritual life do they have? If there's some indicator of spiritual maturity, then I'm inclined to go with people as being innovators and say, let's take a chance with this person, because they're going to have the emotional maturity and the spiritual maturity to be able to sit back and be self-reflective. If the individual doesn't indicate any ability to be self-reflective and to observe who they are in relationship to the organization, that for me is a huge flag that I might be dealing with a trickster.
Thank you. It's really funny because we just had a presentation from Second City, and yesterday they were also talking about how sometimes you just have to give up control, and your instinct is to maintain control. So the parallel between your presentation and what our friends from Second City were talking about was really captivating in different circumstances. So let's go to another question. What are the elements of self-care that strengthen the anti-fragility of our faith in action in this liminal season?
Well, I think the elements of self-care now are not remarkably different than they have ever been, right? There's just a more pronounced need to be able to do that. In order to make the spiritual shifts that I've talked about, you have got to have some kind of stillness around you. You have got to have the ability to differentiate yourself from all that's happening. And in my experience, that always requires some form of stillness and silence. And we all do stillness and silence differently, depending on whether or not you have an extroverted energy base versus an introverted energy base. But for me, getting to a place where I can not only silence my surroundings a little bit, but silence and quiet the chatter in my mind, so that I can do some kind of negation and emptying of myself through prayer practices. So for me, practices of yoga and meditation are really critical to that, but everybody's got their own way of doing that. For me, being in nature always does that, kind of taking me back into putting me into the perspective of a larger whole. But I would say in general, whatever spiritual practices you have discovered throughout your life, for getting yourself centered and being that non-anxious presence is extra important right now. And many of us are actually denying ourselves that because we don't know how to find our way into some of those spaces that we've traditionally relied on, or we feel like our people are in so much crisis, or our staff teams are in overdrive. And so, we've got to work harder to be in contact with people. I think, I say this in the context of a Zoom conference, but I think Zoom is sapping our souls somewhat, right? You just hear this continually from people of, oh, my eyes and my brain are weary from the exposure to the light and the constant images. And so creating some space and break from those things to be able to be that more centered leader is critical.
Here's another wonderful question. How can we have enduring relationships instead of fragmenting relationships?
Boy, I wish I knew the answer to that question. Right? I could make a lot of money if I knew the answer to that question. I do think that it's an important point, because the authenticity of our relationships right now is part of what is going to keep us sane as leaders. And to be able to do those spiritual shifts, when I sit in isolation by myself, detached from my community, it's hard for me to be in that authentic, unknowing, surrendering, attending stance. Because my ego reasserts itself when I grow anxious, right? I really rely on my most authentic relationships with people to help me stay in that space of surrender and unknowing. People who know that I'm trying to do that. And so for me right now, anyway, nurturing that is just about being more intentional about finding ways to connect in those relationships. It's real easy right now to feel like if the only way I can be with this person is virtually, it's not worth it. So, so I'm not going to tend to those relationships, or to put relationships on hold and say they'll pick back up again when we get on the other side of this pandemic. And I think we're in danger when we do that. So I guess the short answer is I don't know the answer, but it's an important question that we have to live with.
I appreciate your sharing. Yesterday, Nadia Boltz-Weber was sharing with us a group of her friends and her hedge of protection. So it is wonderful to have those people who know you, that are honest with you, and they've got your back.
Right.
Yeah. Some of us feel comfortable in liminal seasons, don't love it, but love exploring and the creativity. How do you help denominational leaders know that concept without their thinking that we are the tricksters?
That's a good question. Well, you know, I think we need to have so much grace right now for denominational leaders, because when you think about it, you know, if you think back to what I was saying about how institutions reward traditional authority to people who protect the status quo. We don't let people lead our organizations who are going to let the institution go someplace wild and crazy. We don't give them the reins. So the very people that we have rewarded over time with positions of authority are people whose very nature and stance and assigned job description is to protect the institution, right? And so others of us who don't operate out of those spaces have all kinds of joy and space to go frolicking around with creativity and innovation, and saying, what's wrong with those people that they won't recognize this in us, or won't allow us to do this, or won't reward us for this, when in fact we have tasked them with the very thing that they are doing well, right? So I think all of us have to have a certain amount of grace and humor about this. And those of you who are particularly inventive and creative, right, also need to find ways to work with institutional stronghold people to help them see how you are not a threat, right? That you just can't keep coming at the institutional frameworks out of a sense of disrespect, of saying this just has to go away, because we have to all live together somehow while this thing is imploding and reinventing itself, right? I also want to say, this is not part of the question that was asked, but it's just an observation I want to share about something I've been noticing for those of you out there who are the real creative, innovative types, and who are just very delighted to be in a season like this because of all the unfreezing that's happening. You also have to be kind to yourselves in this season, because I've just noticed a real roller coaster. So back in March, when this first hit, I do a lot of one-on-one coaching with pastors, and I noticed within my coaching client base that there were a lot of people who immediately stepped into high energy and high excitement about, whoa, what's possible here? Let's kind of take advantage of this, right? This is good stuff. This is exciting times. And that energy stayed kind of high until we kind of hit the summer. And then there was kind of this malaise that set in where people are like, oh, this is just kind of going on too long, and this is getting hard. And I also noticed at the beginning of September, when we were supposed to be coming back into the start of a new program year, and we found ourselves still in pandemic, right? And no sense of coming back, and none of the sense of, just every day's Groundhog Day. And nothing feels new and exciting, but it's supposed to be the new and exciting time of the year, and we're still not with our people. I noticed an overall level of despair among pastors in the last month or so that has really frightened me. And I just want to say to all of you that are out there experiencing some of that roller coaster to be kind. There's to yourself and to one another. There is a predictability, I think, to this roller coaster that we're all on. And I think that your own malaise and despair that you may have been experiencing is pretty normative. And that if you can continue to kind of stay with yourself in the disorientation and notice and just wonder about it. Just invite wondering questions about this is how I'm feeling. What am I noticing about that? And what does that have to teach me about what might be coming next? I think we'd all be served well by that kind of a stance.
And just from our observations at the General Commission, that is even increased for women, especially
Yes.
when women are in positions of leadership in the church and managing the families. And as our panel this morning talked about, having to somewhat step back from full-time employment or compromising their own efforts. So they're exhausted and risking so much. So it is, yes, everyone should seek out resources and boundary time and have counseling or whatever is needed to get through this season. It's so incredibly important to take care of yourself. I have another, this is a great question, and you framed it when we're talking about the soul of the institution, which is a concept in and of itself I'm trying to fully take in.
Right.
So with the history of so many institutions, including having systemic racism, discrimination, misogyny, etc., how do we determine whether to tend to the soul of that institution or cut ties and start afresh?
Yeah, that's another question. I have no idea. I have no idea really what the answer to that is, but living in the tension of that is just so critical, of saying none of us is called to sacrifice ourselves and our vocation and our personhood on the altar of the church. I've just never believed that, right? And there are moments for everyone when we have to ask foundationally, is this a place I'm supposed to be because I am supposed to be helping to birth the new thing, right? Or have I actually been released from this to go do another thing that needs to be born, that can't be held and nurtured here, right? And those are questions for you and God to grapple with together, and your spiritual director, perhaps, right? I know for myself that there have been clear moments in my life when I have been released from an institution to go find the next thing. And that's incredibly freeing when that happens. I've also learned to kind of recognize when I'm just kind of grumbly about where I'm at, but that the release isn't there yet, and that there's something in the current place that I need to be attending to. I think a biblical metaphor that I offer for this time in terms of a leader is the character of Moses, right? Who's one of our leadership greats that we lift up as an example of biblical leadership. And if you think about Moses' leadership, he was a purely liminal leader. He took a group of people out of a context they knew and took them and formed them into a people ready for a new chapter, but he was never actually granted access to the new chapter. So his entire leadership journey is a journey of liminality, right? We kind of fight against this season as, oh, really? Is this where I have to spend all my time in this institution that's breaking down, that's not working, that's not doing? Am I going to spend my whole vocational career in this? Maybe you were called for just such a moment as this, and maybe not. Maybe your journey is elsewhere, and it's really only in your journey with God that you can discern that and figure that out. But you have partners in this, right? Even within the institutional setting, there are partners who want you to thrive, who will help you make some of those discernments. And figure out what your calling is. There's a lot of us that will finish our vocational careers in liminality. One of the things I'm noticing is that a lot of the young leaders coming into the church now are not going through any of the grief around the death of the institution the way those of us who've lived in the institution longer are, right? They're thriving on the liminality. Let's let this thing, implode around us so we can figure out what the new thing is. So part of our challenge is we have to distinguish between our own personal grief that we just need to deal with and what might be a very real calling to do a different thing.
Thank you. What advice would you get on how to help a church not rush through the liminal space of having a new senior pastor?
Yeah. Well, we all want to rush out of liminality. We all want to assume that because a new pastor is physically there, we're ready to begin the new thing. So what I've discovered about doing that as a consultant, and I think it might help you in your own leadership roles, is that when I'm trying to help a people become more reflective about where they are, I adopt a stance of wonder about it, and that invites them to do the same. So if I notice people acting out and doing dysfunctional things or trying to rush forward, I just simply stop and say, this is what I'm noticing. I'm noticing that instead of, grappling with our old leadership norms that need to change, that instead of trying to identify what some of those are, we're very eager to get to a new strategic plan. What is it that we think a new plan would accomplish for us? And just to ask more questions, and that gets people to be more reflective, and the more reflective they are, the more inclined they are to be able to stay where they are.
Susan, okay, this is not really a question, but since we're at our time, I'm going to end with this. Susan, you are amazing. Thank you, thank you. I've read your book and introduced it to my leadership team. Again, thank you. Susan, thank you for being with us today. We appreciate your leadership and your advice and your guidance so much. And once again, I will note to everyone, for more of Susan's advice and her wisdom, please go to the link from Cokesbury and be able to follow with her reading more about her good work. Thank you so much for being a part of this I Am Her today.
Such a delight. Thank you, Dawn. Thanks for having me here, and thank you all for listening.